Today we're going to have Dr. Greg Dipple of the British Columbia University coming in to talk to us about mine tailings being used for carbon dioxide removal.
So I'm Greg Dipple. I'm a geologist. I've been a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada for more than 30 years. And for more than 20 of those years, I've been working with the mining industry to look at using their waste streams, in particular the finely crushed rock that comes out as a waste stream from ore extraction, metal extraction, and using that to capture carbon dioxide and turn it into minerals, which is a entirely natural process that regulates climate on this planet in the long term, but normally operates so slowly that it doesn't impact climate on the timeframes that we think of it as humans. But when you take a mountainside and you crush it fine to remove the metals, you increase its surface area a millionfold, and reactions that might take a million years can happen in a year. And so that's the approach that we're using to use this waste stream that's already produced in metal production and put it to good use before it gets covered up and buried in the subsurface and isolated from the atmosphere. So that statement encapsulates a whole bunch of things. We talk about it generally as carbon mineralization, and it encapsulates a whole bunch of different technologies. In my lab at UBC, we focused on a number of them, and they proceeded to the point after 20 years of collaboration and partnership research with mining companies. We've got to the point where we were doing large-scale pilots. Our largest pilot is roughly the size of a football field. Our longest term pilot has been running for almost a year. And so we decided through the university to spin out a company called Carbon Minerals, which we're using to actually form commercial partnerships with operating mines to start to go into their tailings storage facilities and do this at a large scale. So we started the process of looking into forming a company about a couple of years ago. Carbon Minerals was officially formed in September, year and a half ago, just over a year ago, so September 2021, co-founded by myself and two people out of my lab, Peter Showerman and Bethany Ladd. We now are, and that company is I can update you a little bit on that company and where that's at, and then I'll pause and you can tell me what direction you want me to go. So the company is really where the effort is now. My research lab has gone from 14 people in January of last year to 4 in January of this year. So we're basically finishing up the research programs. I'm now at the university only 1 day a week, so the majority of my time is spent with the company. We currently have 10 employees in the company, and we're working on a commercial agreement with a major mining company to deploy our first commercial pilot later this year, with the intent of sequestering. In our first initial small pilot, our goal is to sequester 1,000 tons of CO2, capture from air and mineralize. So our pilot, we want to break the 1,000-ton barrier with our first pilot to show that the technology is viable. That's what we're building towards. It's a toolbox of technologies that we use to accelerate these naturally occurring reactions, but an absolutely critical part of it is doubly redundant monitoring and verification of the CO2, the amount of CO2 that's captured, where it's coming from, and demonstrating that it's safely stored. So a really important part of our technology portfolio is the monitoring and verification technology, which actually feeds back into our process. Our process is sort of iterative, where we go back in and rework and churn and remanipulate the tailings material to sustain high rates of CO2 capture. And those data feed back into our process to make it more efficient. And in the same way, those data are also provided to third parties for them to be able to use those data to independently verify the amount of carbon that we say we've captured and demonstrate that it's stably stored in a solid mineral form.
That was absolutely stupendous. I really appreciate it. That's a great way to start. I think you made things very clear on how this can really affect a large amount of CO2. I want to apologize ahead of time because our teams are very inquisitive and intellectual, and that's part of why I appreciate their company so they would normally be bombarding you with questions, but we were having technical difficulties that was causing a back feed echo that was probably making a few people panic about asking you questions. But we have Cynthia Canavy on, and I'll mute.
Well, I don't know how much of a genius I am because this question is so simple. So are you're taking these tailings and are you putting them back in the same place, or do you have to store them somewhere else, or are they deep under the ground, or where do you store them?
Yeah, in our first pilot, we're operating entirely within the storage facility for the tailings that the mine already uses. So the mine currently operates in a way where it has an open pit, it extracts material, processes it, the waste goes in a separate storage area. Often these things are called tailings ponds. They're not really ponds. A better description would be a tailings sandbox. And then that facility, upon closure of the mine, it gets covered and isolated with a clay surface, revegetated, and reintegrated back into the landscape. So in this particular instance, the tailings, the waste, is stored outside of the hole that's been made, but we use that existing. There's no increase in footprint on any part of the mine operations. Everything we're doing operates within the existing footprint of the pre-existing mine.
And this is where you're finding the nickel?
This is we work mostly with nickel companies. We've worked with a number of different commodity types, but as a company, one of the taglines of our company is to use the mines of the future to tackle the emissions of the past. So we're working very much with critical and battery metal companies because of the anticipated growth that's needed to essentially allow for the transition of our energy sector. So our goal is to work with companies that are already committed to deploying renewable electricity and to decarbonizing their haul fleets. We can work with them to basically get rid of the rest of the hard to abate emissions and go to negative. So with our technology and with those mines designed the way that mining companies are currently looking to design them, we see clear pathways that these mines will be carbon negative. And so we completely decarbonize the supply chain of the metals to the EV industry. And we also generate carbon removal credits, which can be used to offset other parts of the operation. They can be bundled with the metals and sold to the customers to help them decarbonize other parts of, say, Tesla's car manufacturing process. Or they can be sold to other companies like Microsoft or Stripe or Shopify, companies that pay for these carbon removal credits to remove their historical emissions.
That just sounds so exciting.
It's an exciting time. With this, in some ways, all of these changes that drive a lot of this have, they certainly weren't front of mind when we started this 20 years ago. We had no idea where this was going. So we're a lucky, been fortunate in the timing of things that we got started on this early enough that we're in a position to really be able to start to commercialize it and start to deploy it at scale, given on the time frame that we need it, given everything else that's happening.
Well, that's so positive because a lot of these people who are so negative about electric cars and they're talking about all the mining that's needed to make these batteries. I mean, this is huge.
That's a real concern. You know, the way I've heard it described, and I don't think it's too out of whack, is for us to deal with the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at the rate that we have to deal with it in order to avoid these warming scenarios of 2 degrees or greater that we want to avoid. We need to create an industry that's twice as big as the oil and gas industry because we have to solve that problem faster than we made it. So this is a massive industry. When you talk about decarbonizing our economies, our transportation sectors and everything else, it's going to be a massive industry. There's no way around that. And that's, of course, creates a bunch of problems, but there's not a lot of other options if we want to sustain our standards of living, I think.
Well, sometimes you have to do a couple of steps backwards to get your the movement forward. So although yours is a forward movement, which it sounds just really wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I think it's important to remember that we appreciate your questions because they're probably questions other people are thinking about as well.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist.
Actually, I don't think
I'm not one of those intellectuals.
I don't think all of us are scientists, that's for sure. So we appreciate the question. And I'm going to let Sally go ahead and ask her question.
Well, the obvious question that I have is, I'm assuming you see this as relevant for all types of mining. Not having seen the chemical reactions that you're using the CO2 for, and what's the product that's getting produced? Is it, I suppose, limestone? But could this be applied to all types of mining?
Yeah, another set of really good questions. So we focus on deposit. It's the host rock that matters because the waste is the host rock. And we work predominantly with nickel companies. There are different types of nickel deposits. You can get nickel deposits hosted in different kinds of rocks. We work in ultramafic rocks. Ultramafic rocks are magnesium-rich silicate rocks. And we end up making magnesium carbonate instead of calcium carbonate, which would be akin to limestone. So one of the reasons we use ultramafic rocks is that they are the most reactive. So they're kind of the low-hanging fruit. Some of these materials are naturally reactive to the CO2 and air when they're extracted. So that's where we start, and we're developing technologies, sort of reactors or activation technologies that allow other materials to be used in similar fashion. But those pathways for many rock types are not clear and probably very difficult in terms of energy consumption or chemical requirements and so forth. So this would, the most copper production today comes from large porphyry type systems like you have in Chile. Those are very poor host materials for this process. The calcium, there's lots of calcium in those rocks, but it's incredibly difficult to get out of the minerals. And I don't see a economic or feasible way to do that in the near term, but there are research groups that are working hard on that.
Have you done the math to see what the ultimate potential is if you had the approvals, et cetera?
Yeah, so it's
worldwide. I mean,
worldwide. So the scenarios, if we look at sticking with ultramafic rocks, and if we focus on the critical and battery metals, and if you use the projections are 10 to 20 fold increase in the scale of mining for those things to enable the transformation of the energy sector. With those growth scenarios, and if our activation technologies scale up from what we're able to achieve at the benchtop economically, then we can get to, and we use some historical already coexisting ultramafic mine wastes. There are pathways to 1 billion tons a year. The pathway to hundreds of millions of tons is relatively straightforward in those scenarios, and there is a pathway to, the 1 billion tons a year is kind of like this litmus test that everyone holds out for DDR technologies. To do anything at 1 billion tons a year is incredibly difficult. You need to have a pathway to that. Do I think that our process will ultimately be doing 1 billion tons a year? It could. That's a very tall order. But there's clear pathways to get to us into the to the hundreds of millions of tons per year, 500 million tons per year or something is, pathways that we can see. To put it in perspective, we're talking about having a portfolio of technologies by say 2060 or something that's doing 10 billion tons per year. So if we're contributing 1/10 or 1/20 of that, that's still a significant contribution, but it's not the single solution. We need the full portfolio of technologies if we're going to achieve carbon removal at the scale that we need to.
Thank you.
Would you like to go, Tom? Thank you, Sally.
So Greg, did you say you're a geologist?
I did.
Oh, okay. I'm a chemical engineer. And I attended a meeting of I think it was the Kansas Geological Society a couple of months ago. And a lot of these fellows and a couple of women come from a career in oil and gas. And my gosh, I never saw such a bunch of deniers in my life. The presenter knows we have a global warming problem, but there were maybe 20 or 25 there who were outright deniers. I guess it's just, well, I spent my career in helping to produce oil and gas, so I must not have been in the wrong. And so they're deniers. But I have a couple of crazy questions. So, is there any benefit to regenerative agriculture interests in any of the soil? I imagine it has some residual minerals that perhaps might be beneficial in agriculture. And the other question is for commercial enterprises to benefit from this material, would they have to necessarily be fairly close to the source just to minimize cost of trucking?
Right. Yeah. No, two great questions that really connect to that sort of that ecosystem of technologies. We don't advocate spreading mine tailings in fields or in forests, in soils, especially with ultramafic rocks, because they tend to be very good hosts to these ore deposits, because they inherently have a lot of metals like nickel and cobalt and chrome, and some of those metals are can have significant detrimental health benefits. So there is a huge science and academic community and startup community around the idea of amending soils with mineral powders to enhance productivity and also sequester carbon. We think that is a separate technology pathway, and we're not advocating spreading our mine tailings out in fields, because this material, much of it probably wouldn't pass existing regulations in the EU, for example, for what the metal content of soil amendments can have. A big opportunity with soil amendments is that they are a potential pathway to billions of tons at relatively low cost. It's the grinding and the crushing of the rock that's going to be a big issue. And the other big issue there is really understanding the monitoring and verification and how effective it's clear that it produces, that there are productivity benefits. The climate benefits are still a lot of uncertainties around the ultimate climate benefits of mineral amendments to soils and things like that. And that needs to be worked out, and it needs to be the monitoring and verification costs and systems need to be fully incorporated into the economics of how they do that. But we don't advocate. The material we're working with really is better used in other ways. I think one of the things you want to do when you have these opportunities is to step back and say, what's the best use of this material? Not where are all the places that I can apply my technology. I think you need to think about the best use of each of these material streams, and other types of mineral amendments like basalts and things like that have much lower metal contents, probably are much better candidates for addition to soil. And those are the kind of materials that most people are working with. So that makes sense. The other question about industrial use of the material, in the carbon capture storage, this field has gone through so many name changes over the last 20 years. You can kind of pick the acronym you want, but we think of that as utilization. CCUS might be carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And the utilization implies that there's commercial benefit in the product that you make with the carbon dioxide. We're basically burying it with the waste, sealing it, putting it underground, and leaving it there. So there is no commercial use or application. So it's not really a utilization. There is in the sense that it might provide mechanical stability to the tailings and help mitigate some risks associated with tailings storage. There's numerous examples of tailings dam failures and things like that we might be able to help mitigate some of those issues. So that's could think of that as utilization, but not from a commercial standpoint. And many of the mines that we're looking at, that transportation distance becomes really critical. We're often working at mine sites that might be 500 kilometers from a major population area. And the idea that you're going to be generating millions of tons of building materials or products far from any major markets creates a lot of challenges in terms of the utilization of this material. So we're really focused on not just on storage, not utilization, if that distinction makes sense.
So I'm in Texas. If there's any activity you have down here, I'd like to know what ideas you have. Because I've reached out to a couple of companies that do other things to try to make business connections with members of Congress. So if you have any ideas on what could be good business down here in Texas, let me know. I'll throw an address in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we are constrained by geology, and the geology is most of the areas we're focused on would be a different geology than Texas. But you never know. There's some good, a lot of good rocks in Texas.
Thank you so much. Those were great questions, Tom. I see Dick has his hand up.
Thank you, Terry. Folks, I'm Dick Schutzel from Syracuse, New York, with a chapter that hasn't been launched yet, but I'm very grateful for Terry in setting that up. I can't turn on my camera for some reason. If I did, you would realize that I look a little older than my legacy picture there, but it's a pleasure to meet you all. Dr. Dipple, thank you for being here. I have two questions. Number one, as far as the scaling of the necessary mining to maintain the lifestyles that we have in our modern culture, I'm a little bit concerned that the resulting tailings will have an impact on the need for maintaining biodiversity. So what do you see as the impact when you're in a, very simplistically, you're in a mining operation and these are scaling up many, many times. The tailings have to go somewhere and they're not going back to where they're extracted. Is there an end of life plan for returning tailings to where they came from, or is there some way you can that you're looking to address that to maintain biodiversity? That's my first question. Second question is, as I understand it, the purpose of our local chapters is grassroots and getting advocacy and education. How can we help you have people better understand this technology so that the legislative process, regulatory process moves along at the pace that it needs to in order for the impact to be to truly help us with our goal of CO2 sequestration?
Right. Yeah. Two very good questions. The ecological impact and the biodiversity impacts are really significant. There's no way you're going to create large new industrial operations and not have impacts. You have to look at the balance. How can you do it in a way that minimizes those other impacts so that the net effect, including the climate effect, is overall positive in some objective arm's length sort of assessment? And those are very difficult assessments to do. When you look at a mine site, the size of a mine site, the pit is only one small part of that. The tailings storage facility is typically larger than the pit, and then if you actually look at the area of disturbed ground, it's much larger than that, even more. So the tailings storage itself is only one part of that. Certainly bigger than the pit. When you think about a mine, you tend to think of what the pit looks like or something, but it's bigger than that, and those are issues we'll have to deal with. The mining industry is looking hard on new ways of storing tailings to reduce those impacts in terms of the footprints. And broadly speaking, and those are still in line with some of the technologies that we're developing to be able to use those tailings to store carbon dioxide. They might make it more difficult to capture CO2 from air, so we might be partnering with a company that has a direct air capture system and using that to deliver more concentrated CO2 into a process. But to give you an example of, the three of the ways that the mining industry is looking to try and reduce that impact is, one is, there are initiatives around to essentially go to zero waste mining. I think that's, I view that as aspirational. But what they're talking about then is, reusing their tailings for other things. And that gets to Tom's question, for example, in terms of creating a building product or something else that might be able to use this material. They're looking at more and more new mines will be underground mines and not open pits. So the surface expression is much smaller. And there's an opportunity ultimately to refill the underground workings with tailings. And you can do that with pits as well. If you're in the type of a deposit where you can have multiple pits or multiple mines, so that you can do the first one, and then as you open up the second, you fill the first with the waste from the second, something like that. So there are some really interesting projects that are being looked at in that way. And then the third is to a whole new way of storing tailings, which essentially allows them to be safely stored more as vertical features than as horizontal ones, so that you can store a larger volume of material in a smaller land area, because you might be building that pile at a rate of a couple meters per year or a few meters per year rather than 20 centimeters or 50 centimeters per year. So you can reduce the impact that way, but you will never get rid of it. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, to say that those are, first order concerns, and there's going to be instances where it doesn't make sense, but we need to have all of those considerations at hand when we look at doing these developments. But there are going to be impacts, almost certainly, and we're going to have to understand and mitigate those for sure. I think the question about how to engage the public on this is, at what level, especially these days, that's something I try and stay away from, because it seems so difficult and fraught with risk and harm. But I think if I step back and as a company, we're tied by the hip to the mining industry. Our process, our technology really only makes sense at large scale if it's tied to the development of critical battery metals. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. To open up thousands and thousands of new mines to sequester CO2, I don't think is necessarily a good idea. There needs to be other reasons for doing it, like enabling the transformation of the energy sector. So it becomes an issue of the public perception of mining, which is absolutely horrible. Mines can't get employees. Mining programs, geology programs can't get students. So the whole mining industry, which we need to allow for the transformation in the energy sector, has got one of the worst reputation industries on the planet. And much of that is well-deserved from past behavior, no doubt about it. But we as a society the mining industry has to step up and lead by example and show how they can change and be different. And I think there are some good players in that space in the mining industry, some significant, major good players. I was at the Energy and Mines conference in Toronto a few months ago, and seeing the progress that company after company after company was standing up and showing in deployment of renewables, investing in technology to build haul fleets that actually run without carbon-based fuels. They're moving large tonnage of rocks with trucks that are operated on batteries and hydrogen fuel cells and things like that. Some really innovative technologies where they use trolley wires to get out of the pit. They use regenerative braking to go back down the pit, and they only run on the battery when they're down in the pit, and the roads are constantly changing. So there's really innovative ways to do this. So back to your question, the mining industry needs to be, we have to find a way for society to re-embrace the mining industry as being an industry that's going to help us solve this problem. And that is not necessarily going to be a very easy thing to do. How's that for a challenge?
Thank you very much. Those are all amazing answers. Melanie had a question, but I can't get my chat to get larger so that I can see what the question was. Give me just a moment. Let me fight with it. Or we could let Melanie try, but she was... Do you want to try?
Oh.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering about how you were powering this method, Greg.
How you would power? Sorry, I missed that.
Yes, believe she asked about powering the system.
Right. So it's we have a suite of technologies, some of which have very low energy requirements, and some of which have more significant ones. So the answer to that at a very high level, whether you're looking at direct air capture systems or other ways of doing carbon dioxide removal, many of them have very high energy requirements, which only compound this issue of obviously of transforming the energy systems that we use. At the get-go, the systems that we're starting with have very low energy needs, less than 1% additional energy requirement at the mine site. But those aren't going to scale to 200 to 300, 400, 500 million tons per year. Those are only going to scale to tens of millions of tons per year because they rely on specific opportunities. So one thing to really emphasize here is this isn't a single technology that we're trying to deploy at every mine site in the world. This is a portfolio, a toolbox of technologies, and different ones will work in different climates and different rock types and in different types of mines. Climate, mine design, and geology all have first order impacts on what you can do and how you can do it. And some of those will have significant energy needs. We specifically design our tools to work with two key constraints at scale. One is they have to operate using renewable energy, not thermal energy. So there's an opportunity so you can do things while avoiding fossil fuel or not having to bring in, the thermal energy issues are significant. We don't want to compound those, so we avoid that. But the other thing we need to be able to do is to operate at the scale of a large mine, and a large mine operates at about 20 tons per minute. So if we're going to have chemical reactors, we have chemical reactors that are handling 20 tons of rock a minute, 24 hours a day, 300 plus days a year. So you can't have large residence times in your circuit and things like that. You need to deploy technologies that can treat 10, 15 million tons of rock a year. And those are the two really fundamental design parameters that we have. Avoid any significant use of thermal energy, and have systems that are designed to ultimately operate at that scale. So for example, if you have a chemical reactor that has a 2-hour residence time, or a 2-day residence time, you need 10 million Olympic swimming pools or something as the size of your reactor, and that's economically, not viable. So you need to think about your technologies as operating at scale, and they need to basically really avoid large use of thermal energy. But some of the technologies do have significant energy usages for sure.
I want to say that this has been the fastest 46 minutes. This was a very fast meeting so far, and I really am impressed with your answers. They're exactly the kind of thing we're looking to know. I wanted to ask just up front, and before I go back to Cynthia, what could we do to help make it so that people are coming to you asking for your capacity to be able to sequester carbon?
That's a good question. It's an odd space right now, right? The carbon removal space is a bit odd right now. The most fundamental as a company right now, one of the most important things for us, we have, as I mentioned, we have 10 employees. Most of them are focused really hard on research and development and scaling up these technologies. But the other is, I'm not sure so one of the classic lines about the mining industry is a race to be number 2. Nobody ever wants to be the first. So we're still trying to find the mine to be the first. And we think we've found one or two that will be the first, but it's been a long time in negotiations and discussions. So these, we're going in and messing with multi-billion-dollar investments, large industrial operations that have many of them lifetimes, 40 to 50 year lifetimes in terms of their operations. And so the operators, of course, are very careful and cautious about what they do. So getting this going in operating mines is a challenge. it's easy to find juniors that want to make mines and talk about how they're going to sequester carbon, but that's because they're trying to develop and sell their property. To go in with someone that's actually producing today and deploy these technologies requires a lot of careful planning and discussion. And that and technology development are really where our primary focus is today. So I kind of didn't answer your question, but the mining industry has flipped. They get it, that this is actually a huge opportunity for them as an industry. And that awareness has really developed significantly in the last 2 years, in my experience. It was there at some level, but it's become prevalent in the last 2 years. And so now we're poised to take advantage of that. So that's where the convincing needs to be done for us to develop our technology, because we need the partners to deploy it. We're not trying to deploy this technology by ourselves. We fundamentally partner with mining companies to do what we do. But getting the word out about how this is a pathway to help us achieve a number of things, including the electric vehicles and things like that, getting that word out to the general public that's realistic pathways to achieve these outcomes that recognize the products that we're going to need, the scale of industrial production that's going to be needed. I don't think the general public gets that we're talking about massive industrial investments and operations here to achieve these things.
That's amazing. And actually, that's really helpful because at the very least, we can put it in our conversation pocket to be able to bring up to people when we're talking about carbon dioxide removal in general. So once again, we appreciate you being here. I see 2 hands are still up. So Cynthia, would you like to go?
Yeah, just one more question. So I can hear the echo. So is this going to be a big job creation? And if so, what are the requirements to work at that facility?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a significant area for jobs. Absolutely. You need people to do things, and many of the job skills are not new skills in the sense that you're working at a mine site, you have to operate big equipment and do things like that. So those needs will be there. But there's also a huge effort in the mining industry. It really depends on jurisdiction, but there's a huge effort in the mining industry to do a lot of automation. So, I've heard major mining companies whose names you would recognize talk behind closed doors, the mine of the future. The only humans on site are security and maintenance. The drivers, all the vehicles are being driven autonomously from a city 1,000 kilometers away. Everything's being operated remotely and driven, and things are being done autonomously. And so that, as in general, that speaks to a significant reduction in the types or in the number of jobs and in the types of jobs that you'd ultimately have on these operations. Of course, if they're growing tenfold, there'll still be a lot of jobs. You don't have those conversations when you're talking to a mining company that's based in South Africa. Employment and job creation is so fundamental to their value, to their communities.
Really?
That they don't look at that, right? They need to provide jobs to their communities. And so I think that answer to that question in some ways will be dependent on the jurisdiction.
Well, I feel the same way when I go to Safeway and they want these people to scan their own groceries or whatever. But you're going to need people there who's going to be able to repair those scanners when they don't function. Yeah. So half of it takes away jobs, and then the other half creates jobs. So yeah, it's a tough sell. I'm sorry, it really is. I just want people to be able to have a job so they can support their families.
No, it's a retraining problem as well, right? I mean, to your point, I think it's still going to require a lot. These machines are going to break down, but you're not going to be driving them. So you need to train people for these new jobs. But
I'd like to point out, as somebody who's had some family member die of black lung, I totally like the idea of automating a system of mining, because I don't want to have anybody doing that job. As far as I'm concerned, that's just, he died at 43 or something. I never even got to meet him. So there are some jobs that are great to be automated in my perspective. but I do
Oh, no, I
understand.
hear you, Terry. I do.
Of course, I know you're a good egg. Of course, you care about that. But I think that that's something else that can be thought of. I know that we're trying to bring an industry that has 5,000 jobs worldwide into millions of people employed, but eventually there would be people in a large enough crew to oversee some of the automation. I'm sure that there's jobs that will be created if it's a large enough facility. And job creation isn't the only thing. I also want to be able to drive those EV cars and have a really cool battery system that actually lasts and charges and retains its charge for as long as possible. So if that's what nickel's going to do, then I'm all for it. Take all the nickel out of the ground. If it helps. Isn't the core of the earth itself all nickel? I mean, let's just go for it. But I also have seen some of the devastation created by mines. So I recognize the importance of something you started off this conversation with. Thank you for bringing up monitoring, reporting, and verification, and pointing out that it's important to keep track of how much we're actually doing and achieving and the rest of that. That's really an important aspect. I see Diane still has her hand up. Thank you for the question, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you are familiar with our founder, Peter Fikowski, and the book that he wrote about the need for climate restoration and getting CO2 back out of the atmosphere?
I have not read it. No, I've heard of the book, but I have not read it.
Well, I'm just thinking that might be a great resource for you to promote what you're doing. And there's also a documentary coming out sometime this month, I understand, if it's on time. And that would be an even faster way to communicate to people other than reading a book.
I think that the documentary is only coming out partially at this point, but I don't know for sure. So I'll get back to you guys on more information with that. And I do look forward to it. The documentarian that's been working on that is amazing. I think it's all done. I think they're just down to the last details. So he's up here in the Pacific Northwest, so I can double check with him and find out more about what's going on with that. Thank you for bringing that up, Diane.
Yeah.
I see Rich has his hand up. Rich from Philadelphia. Oh,
yes.
I'm sorry. Were you done, Diane? I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Rich. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand, since the technology for sequestering the carbon is not going to be used in like a product, an end product, like for like building materials, who would be the customer for this?
Yeah, so if we're doing, so if we're doing straight storage, then the minerals, the carbon dioxide is captured from air. The CO2, the carbon dioxide binds with the magnesium that's liberated from the tailings, and it makes magnesium carbonate, which would be like calcium carbonate, limestone, calcite. The chalk that rock climbers use is magnesium carbonate, as an example. So that would be an example of what the material that we're creating is. But it's being created as a cement that cements together all the grains within the tailings. So it's not a standalone single product. There are ways you can design processes that generate that, but if you're going to be doing 1 million tons a year, that becomes a challenge. So we just cement up these tailings, which then end up getting covered in clay liners, and then basically they restore the soil and then they revegetate. So in essence, all of that carbon dioxide becomes part of the subsurface in a mineral form and has no utilization. So then what's the business model? The business model is one that the mine companies will be paying for the cost of reducing those last hard to abate emissions. You know, if you look at the cost curves for reducing emissions, that last 10% is really hard to get rid of. So you essentially want to inset it or offset it. You want to get rid of it. You're going to allow for it to go, and you're going to have to get rid of it through some sort of an accommodation, which if you're doing it yourself, a company would call an inset. If you're doing it for someone else, you might call it an offset. So they'll be paying for those offsets for us. So they'll be paying us to do that work such that they create those insets within their operations. But there's clear pathways to do that and generate more carbon removal credits than they need to get rid of their hard to abate emissions. At which point you have carbon removal credits, which can be sold. Right now, they're sold on the private market. As a company, we have 2 pre-purchase agreements. One with Shopify and one with Frontier was just announced just before Christmas, was $500,000. So we have pre-purchase agreements to take up most of what we hope to accomplish next year. And that is for our very first pilot, it's not sufficient to cover the full cost, but it's helping offset a significant part of that cost. And we have funding from government entities in Canada and private supporters to help us get rid of the rest of those, to cover the rest of those costs. But the long-term business model is one in which we're being paid to get rid of the hard to abate emissions by the operator, and then any removal credits that go beyond that are then paid for by whomever wants them. Some mining companies want those removal credits because they're going to bundle it with the metal and then sell that metal. Essentially, they're going to get rid of their, help get rid of their downstream carbon footprint by bundling carbon removal credits with their product. So you can imagine that the nickel would come to Tesla with a carbon credit instead of a carbon debit, and help Tesla make cars as zero carbon footprint manufacturing.
That is amazing. That was very interesting. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us, especially so last minute. That was really kind of you.